That night, we lay on the floor in the room, and I listened to the silkworms eating. The silkworms fed in racks of mulberry leaves, and all night you could hear them eating, and a dropping sound in the leaves. I myself did not want to sleep, because I had been living for a long time with the knowledge that if I ever shut my eyes in the dark and let myself go, my soul would go out of my body. I had been that way for a long time, ever since I had been blown up at night and felt it go out of me and go off and then come back. I tried never to think about it, but it had started to go since, in the nights, just at the moment of going off to sleep, and I could only stop it by a very great effort. So while now I am fairly sure that it would not really have gone out, yet then, that summer, I was unwilling to make the experiment. I had different ways of occupying myself while I lay awake. I would think of a trout stream I had fished along when I was a boy, and fish its whole length, very carefully, in my mind, fishing very carefully under all the logs, all the turns of the bank, the deep holes, and the clear, shallow stretches, sometimes catching trout and sometimes losing them. I would stop fishing at noon to eat my lunch, sometimes on a log over the stream, sometimes on a high bank under a tree, and I always ate my lunch very slowly and watched the stream below me in the backyard while I ate. Often I ran out of bait because I would take only 10 worms with me in a tobacco tin when I started. When I had used them all, I had to find more worms, and sometimes it was very difficult digging in the bank of the stream where the cedar trees kept out of the sun, and there was no grass, but only the bare, moist earth, and often I could find no worms. Always, though, I found some kind of bait, but one time in the swamp I could find no bait at all and had to cut up one of the trout I had caught and use him for bait. Sometimes I found insects in the swamp meadows, in the grass or under ferns, and used them. There were beetles and insects with legs like grass stems, and grubs in old rotten logs, white grubs with brown pinching heads that would not stay on the hook and emptied into nothing in the cold water, and wood ticks under logs where sometimes I found angleworms that slipped into the ground as soon as the log was raised. Once I used a salamander from under an old log. The salamander was very small and neat and agile and a lovely colour. He had tiny feet that tried to hold on to the hook, and after that one time I never used a salamander, although I found them very often. Nor did I use crickets, because of the way they acted about the hook. Sometimes the stream ran through an open meadow, and in the dry grass I would catch grasshoppers and use them for bait, and sometimes I would catch grasshoppers and toss them into the stream and watch them float along, swimming on the stream and circling on the surface as the current took them, and then disappear as a trout rose. Sometimes I would fish 4 or 5 different streams in the night, starting as near as I could get their source, and fishing then downstream. When I had finished too quickly, and the time did not go, I would fish the stream over again, starting where it emptied into the lake, and fishing back upstream, trying for all the trout I had missed coming down. Some nights, too, I made up streams, and some of them were very exciting, and it was like being awake and dreaming. Some of those streams I still remember, and think that I have fished in them, and they are confused with streams I really know. I gave them all names, and went to them on the train, and sometimes walked for miles to get to them. But some nights I could not fish, and on those nights I was cold awake and said my prayers over and over, and tried to pray for all the people I had ever known. That took up a great amount of time, for if you try to remember all the people you have ever known, going back to the earliest thing you remember, which was, for me, the attic of the house where I was born, and my mother and father's wedding cake in a tin box hanging from one of the rafters, and in the attic jars of snakes and other specimens that my father had collected as a boy and preserved in alcohol. The alcohol sunken in the jars, so the backs of some of the snakes and specimens were exposed and had turned white, If you thought back that far, you remembered a great many people. If you prayed for all of them, saying a Hail Mary and an Our Father for each one, it took a long time, and finally it would be light. And then you could go to sleep if you were in a place where you could sleep in the daylight. On those nights, I tried to remember everything that had ever happened to me, starting with just before I went to the war and remembering back from one thing to another. I found I could only remember back to that attic in my grandfather's house. Then I would start there and remember this way again until I reached the war. I remembered after my grandfather died, we moved away from that house into a new house designed and built by my mother. Many things that were not to be moved were burned in the backyard, and I remember those jars from the attic being thrown in the fire and how they popped in the heat and the fire flamed up from the alcohol. I remember the snakes burning in the fire in the backyard. But there were no people in that, only things. I could not remember who burned the things even, and I would go on until I came to people and then stop and pray for them. About the new house, I remembered how my mother was always cleaning things out and making a good clearance. One time, when my father was away on a hunting trip, she made a good, thorough cleaning out in the basement and burned everything that should not have been there. When my father came home and got down from his buggy and hitched the horse, the fire was still burning in the road beside the house. I went out to meet him. He handed me his shotgun and looked at the fire. "What's this?" he asked. "I've been cleaning out the basement, dear," my mother said from the porch. She was standing there, smiling, to meet him. My father looked at the fire and kicked at something. Then he leaned over and picked something out of the ashes. "Get a rake, Nick," he said to me. I went to the basement and brought a rake, and my father raked very carefully in the ashes. He raked out stone axes and stone skinning knives and tools for making arrowheads and pieces of pottery and many arrowheads. They had all been blackened and chipped by the fire. My father raked them all out very carefully and spread them on the grass by the road. His shotgun in its leather case and his game bags were on the grass where he had left them when he stepped down from the buggy. "Take the gun and the bags in the house, Nick," and started towards the house. "Take them one at a time," my father said. "Don't try and carry too much at once." I put down the game bags and took in the shotgun and brought out a newspaper from the pile in my father's office. My father spread all the blackened, chipped stone implements on the paper and then wrapped them up. "The best arrowheads went all to pieces," he said. He walked into the house with the paper package, and I stayed outside on the grass with the 2 game bags. After a while, I took them in. In remembering that, there were only 2 people, so I would pray for them both. There's actually a little bit more of that story, but we're going to cut it here, and I'm going to move on to... So Echo Spring works over this story several times. I keep returning to it and looking at it in various different lights in terms of Hemingway's own story, and this section here is the last time that I visit it. Recently I'd read that in an early draft of this story, the mother who presides over that toxic bonfire says 2 sentences, not one. The second is, "Ernie helped me." The only time, apparently, in all the typescripts of the Nick Adams stories that Ernest's name is used in place of Nick's. This isn't to say that Now I Lay Me is necessarily autobiographical, or that it really happened, though it has a tendency to be quoted in Hemingway biographies as gospel fact. Not so. It's fiction with all the wonderful, ungraspable fluidity that suggests. But even without the anchoring presence of Ernest's name, the scene is overwhelmingly articulate about the effects a corrosive dynamic between parents might have on a small child. There was a great fashion a while back for making the burned and broken arrowheads a metaphor for castration, and in some ways it's undeniable, though doing so takes away from Hemingway's refined, ferocious attention on objects as they are. There's such a note of grief in the description of those damaged snakes and damaged arrowheads, a conjuring of the child's marvellous gift for attention. That one person can willfully damage or exert power over another, and that this damage can be enacted not so much symbolically as materially in the beloved, consoling world of things, can leave a child with impossible, indigestible sadness and rage. A feeling not dissimilar, I guess, to having a shard of blackened stone lodged within one's chest. It seems at least some of this unhappy relationship was drawn from life. In her son's estimation, Grace Hemingway was a bustling, domineering woman, while her husband was gentle and evasive, sometimes overcome by depression, and sometimes by fits of rage. Ed was a lifelong teetotaler and suffered until his death an intense anxiety about money. He made his wife and children keep account books, and even when they were almost grown, was still enforcing petty rules about dancing and library cards. Excited and exacting, his daughter Marceline put it, irritable and exacting. He spanked his children, but he also had a sense of honour and a love of the outdoors that were immediately infectious. Grace, on the other hand, exerted her personality in ways her son had balked against since boyhood, as well, of course, as having dressed him in infancy as a girl. It was all coming apart, anyhow. In October 1928, a few weeks after the birth of Hemingway's son Patrick, he visited his parents in what had been his boyhood home, 600 North Kenilworth Avenue, Oak Park, Illinois, the house his mother had both designed and paid for. During the visit, Ed seemed tired, irritable, and not at all well, though he didn't discuss the worries that had begun to bear down on him like a ton of bricks. He'd planned on retiring to a practice in Florida and had bought up land during the real estate boom as an investment. But now, the crash was underway and his finances as well as his health were precarious. He'd been diagnosed with angina pectoris and diabetes, a touch of the sugar, as he told his colleagues. After Hemingway left, Ed wrote him a brief, fond note. In with the letter was another envelope addressed to my son. Inside there was a poem written in Ed's slanting hand. I can't seem to think of a way to say what I'd most like to say to my very dear son, whose book is just done, except give him my love and hooray. He'd put the same odd quotation marks around the word Dad in the letter too. A month went by. Then, on 6th of December, he woke with a pain in his foot. The doctor in him immediately foresaw diabetic neuropathy, gangrene, amputation, an unspooling ticker-tape of grim eventuality. In pain and increasingly frantic about an unpayable debt, he told Grace that he was scared. She suggested he talk to a doctor, but he didn't. He went out and returned to the house before noon, going down to the basement where he burned a few papers. Then he called up to his wife that he was tired and would rest before lunch. He went into his bedroom, closed the door, and shot himself in the right temple with his father's .32 caliber Smith & Wesson. At that moment, Hemingway was eating lunch in the Brevoort Hotel in New York, where 10 years later John Cheever would drink whole afternoons away. His companion was his 5-year-old son Bumby, who'd just arrived from Paris. After lunch, they went to Penn Station and boarded the Havana Special to Key West. Just outside Trenton, a porter delivered a telegram from Oak Park. It read, Father died this morning, arranged to stop here if possible. Reeling, he got off the train at Philadelphia, leaving his small son to travel on in the care of the porter. He only had $40 in cash, not nearly enough to get home. He telegrammed his editor, Max Perkins, asking him to wire money by way of Western Union. Then, figuring Max had probably already left the office, he telephoned Scott Fitzgerald, who was living at the time in Delaware. Scott answered the phone immediately agreed. A few days later, Hemingway wrote from Oak Park, "You were damned good and also bloody effective to get me that money." My father shot himself, as I suppose you may have read in the papers. "We'll send you the $100 as soon as I reach Key West." I was fond as hell of my father and feel too punk, also sick, etc., to write a letter, but wanted to say thank you. Punk. A word a woodsman might use to describe a tree that's rotten, that looks all right, until you realise you can tear into it with your bare hands. To Max Perkins, a week later, he added more details. Various worthless lands in Michigan, Florida, etc., with taxes to pay on all of it. No other capital, all gone. My father carried 20 to 30-year endowment insurance, which was paid and lost in Florida. He had angina pectoris and diabetes, preventing him from getting any more insurance. Sunk all his savings, my grandfather's estate, etc., in Florida. Hadn't been able to sleep with pain, etc. Knocked him temporarily out of his head. Dr. Hemingway, who sometimes washed his son's mouth out with soap, sometimes beat him with a razor strop, who was sometimes implacable, turned temper on a halfpenny, who drove into his boy a principle of honour and sportsmanship that never wholly left him, who passed on from hand to hand those nourishing loves for the Michigan woods, for clear water, jacksnipe, wild geese, dead grass, new corn, deserted orchards, cider mills, open fires. Open your mouth, boy. One more stone to swallow down.